The war in the Pacific did not end in one moment for those who lived through it. For the Japanese women captured during its final years, the war ended slowly, in silence, behind the fences of American camps. They expected the end to mean shame, hunger, humiliation. Instead, they discovered something that unsettled them far more: the strange gaze of the very soldiers who had defeated their homeland. These were not the faces they imagined when told Americans were demons, brutal conquerors who would strip them of dignity. The men who walked the camp perimeters were tall, broad-shouldered, with uniforms neatly pressed, rifles carried with casual ease. To the women, weary from transport and fear, the sight of these soldiers was terrifying in a way they could not name. It was not cruelty that frightened them, but the possibility of something more human. At first, they braced themselves. Each order shouted in English felt like a threat. Each glance from a guard burned like fire. They whispered at night, voices hushed, recalling what they had been told: that to be captured was to lose honor, that these men would treat them as spoils. Their bodies tensed at every step, waiting for cruelty. But days passed, then weeks, and nothing happened. The soldiers were strict but not savage. They kept their distance, issued commands, enforced routines. Yet in their eyes lingered something the women did not expect. It was not hatred, it was not triumph. It was something closer to curiosity, even admiration. Some women caught these looks and recoiled, confused. Others pretended not to notice. But all of them felt it. The weight of eyes that saw them not as prisoners, not even as enemies, but as women. One prisoner scribbled in her hidden diary, "I saw him watching, not with cruelty, but with something softer. I hated him for it because it unsettled me more than hatred would have." The Icans themselves were no less conflicted. Many of the guards were young, scarcely out of their teens, pulled from farms and cities across the United States. They had fought in jungles, seen death on beaches, carried comrades on stretchers. Now they walked between barracks filled with women who looked nothing like the propaganda posters. They expected defiance, scorn, perhaps hatred. Instead, they found quiet figures who lowered their eyes but carried dignity in silence. The sight moved them in ways they had not anticipated. One soldier confessed in a letter never sent, "I came here expecting monsters. Instead, I find women not so different from those at home. I remind myself they are the enemy, but my heart forgets." It began with small moments. A guard holding a gate too long, his eyes lingering as a group passed through. Another stumbling over Japanese words he had learned from a dictionary, trying clumsily to offer direction without harshness. A soldier adjusting his cap nervously when a prisoner looked back at him. These gestures meant little in isolation, but together they painted a truth the women could not ignore. Some of their captors were not only curious, they were smitten. At first, the women whispered of it in mockery. "He stares like a fool. He cannot hide his blush." Yet beneath their laughter lay unease. What did it mean to be looked at with admiration by the enemy? Was it humiliation? Was it danger? Or was it something even more frightening? A reminder of their own humanity, reflected in the eyes of their captors. The camp became a place of strange contradictions. During the day, soldiers enforced discipline, barking orders, escorting prisoners to labor details. At night, the atmosphere shifted. From across the wire, the women saw young men gathered around fires, laughing, passing cigarettes, strumming guitars. In those unguarded moments, they looked less like conquerors and more like boys. And when their eyes met across the fence, something passed between them, something that neither side could name, something forbidden yet undeniable. One evening, as the sun set behind the barracks, a soldier paused during his patrol. His eyes met those of a woman carrying water. For a long moment, neither moved. She lowered her gaze quickly, but not before seeing the flush on his face. That night, she told her companions, "He looked at me as though he knew me, as though I was not his enemy, but a woman he might have met anywhere in the world." For the soldiers, the struggle deepened. They were warned sternly. No fraternization, no contact, no exceptions. To cross that line meant punishment, disgrace, perhaps court-martial. Yet their hearts betrayed them. They found themselves dreaming of the women, imagining conversations that could never happen, futures that could never exist. One guard wrote in his notebook, "I fight the urge every day, not to touch, not even to speak, but to see them as women. It is wrong, yet it is human." For the women, the shock lay not only in being admired, but in how that admiration was restrained. They had been taught to expect violation. Instead, they found respect wrapped in silence. It was this paradox that unsettled them most. A prisoner wrote, "We prepared for dishonor. Instead, they gave us glances we could not bear. Mercy is heavier than cruelty, for it forces us to question everything." The attraction remained unspoken, yet it colored every interaction. Bread passed with a fleeting brush of fingers. A guard's voice softening when calling a name. A soldier turning his head quickly when caught staring too long. Each moment carried the weight of what could never be. By winter, the women began to see the men differently. They remained captors, yes, but they were also young, vulnerable, burdened by their own silences. The shock was no longer in being feared, but in being desired. And though they could never admit it aloud, some felt the sting of recognition, that they too, despite themselves, saw their enemies not as faceless soldiers, but as men. The war had ended, but another war raged in silence. It was not fought with rifles or bayonets, but with glances, with restraint, with the ache of what could not be spoken. For the Japanese women who lived behind the wire, the greatest shock of their captivity was not cruelty, but love withheld, the quiet, dangerous truth that some of their captors had fallen for them. The barracks settled into routine, but routine did not erase the weight of glances. The women felt them daily, those stolen looks cast by guards who were supposed to see them only as prisoners. At first, those looks had frightened them. Later, they mocked them among themselves. But as weeks turned into months, the mocking grew quieter, replaced by something more dangerous: silence. For silence meant acknowledgement, and acknowledgement meant truth. The truth was that these men were not blind. They noticed the curve of a hand, the way a scarf fell against a shoulder, the small gestures of women carrying water or mending clothes. They noticed, and, in noticing, betrayed something no regulation could erase. One soldier admitted in his private notes, "I should not look. I tell myself every day, but I am only human. When I see her walk across the yard, I feel something I cannot describe." The women noticed too. They noticed when a soldier's voice softened as he gave an order. They noticed when bread was handed gently, when blankets were folded neatly, when a rifle strap was adjusted nervously under a lingering gaze. One prisoner whispered to another, "He looks at me as though I am not behind wire, as though I am not his prisoner." The paradox tore at them. They had been raised to believe capture was worse than death. To feel desired by the enemy was dishonor beyond imagining. Yet the desire was not cruel, not mocking, not triumphant. It was something far more unsettling. It was longing. It was admiration. It was, in some cases, love. One evening, while returning from a work detail, a woman stumbled under the weight of a sack. A soldier stepped forward instinctively, steadying her before quickly retreating. Their eyes met for only an instant, but that instant carried more meaning than words could hold. That night she wrote secretly in her diary, "I should have felt shame. Instead, I felt warmth. I hated myself for it, but I cannot forget the way he looked at me." The guards struggled no less. They were warned again and again. No fraternization, no contact, no exceptions. To break the rule meant punishment, disgrace, perhaps worse. Yet their hearts betrayed them. They dreamed of the women, imagined conversations, futures, impossible moments beyond fences. One soldier wrote in his journal, I hear her laugh. It is like a knife in my chest. I wish to hear it again, and yet I must pretend I do not. At night the camps grew quieter, but the silence was not empty. From barracks, soldiers heard the soft murmur of Japanese voices, the sound of songs sung softly in the dark, the occasional laughter that broke through despair. They listened, restless, haunted by the humanity that proximity forced upon them. And the women, lying on hard bunks, heard the rhythm of boots outside, the low voices of soldiers speaking in English, the sighs of men as weary as they were. In that silence, both sides felt the same truth. They were not monsters. They were young, alive, burdened by feelings that war forbade, but could not kill. The first gestures appeared like cracks in stone. A soldier left a canteen filled with clean water near the barracks door without a word. Another, when handing out bread, let his fingers brush against a prisoner's hand for a second longer than necessary. A woman, sewing by the light of a lantern, left a scrap of fabric at the edge of the yard where she knew a soldier would find it. None of these gestures were overt. None could be punished. Yet they spoke loudly to those who understood. One diary recorded, "He placed the bread in my hand, and for a moment I felt the warmth of his fingers. It was nothing, and yet it was everything. For the rest of the day I could not think of anything else." Whispers spread through the barracks. Some condemned these gestures as betrayal. "Do you not see? They make us weak." Others defended them quietly. "Would you rather they look at us with hatred?" The arguments never ended, but the truth was undeniable. Something dangerous was growing in the shadows of the camp. The guards knew it too. Reports reached commanders of excessive familiarity. Warnings were repeated, punishments were threatened. But affection is not so easily ordered away. If anything, the warnings deepened the secrecy, sharpened every glance, made every silence heavier. One soldier, writing decades later, confessed, "It was not love as the world knows it. It was love bound in silence, built from stolen moments, carried like fire in the chest. We never spoke, we never touched, yet I loved her more fiercely than I have ever loved anyone." The women carried their own secrets. Some admitted quietly to each other that they felt something they could not explain. One said, "He is my enemy, yet when he looks at me, I remember that I am still alive. I am still a woman." Another answered, "We must never say this aloud, but I feel it too." The strangest part was the restraint itself. Desire could have destroyed them. Violation could have confirmed every fear. But restraint left them disarmed, unsettled, forced to confront humanity where they expected only cruelty. It made them question not only their captors, but themselves. One woman wrote years later, "The greatest shock was not that they wanted us, but that they loved us enough not to act. That restraint haunted me all my life." The bonds deepened during rare moments of vulnerability. One storm flooded the camp, soaking bunks and leaving both guards and prisoners drenched. A soldier, shivering, passed a blanket through the fence to a woman without a word. She accepted it, their hands brushing in the exchange. Neither spoke, but that night both lay awake, replaying the moment in silence. Another time, a soldier played a harmonica softly during patrol. The women listened through the thin walls, and one began to hum along. Soon others joined, voices blending with the faint melody. The guard stopped, startled, then continued playing. For those few minutes, the camp was filled with music that crossed the divide. A diary recorded, "We sang with them, though no words were shared. It was as if the wire melted, and for a moment we belonged to the same world." For the Americans, these moments carried pride and torment in equal measure. Pride because they upheld their duty, resisted temptation, honored their discipline. Torment because in resisting, they carried the ache of longing that never eased. One veteran in old age confessed, "I never kissed her. I never even spoke her name, but she was with me every day of my life." For the women, the paradox never faded. They had been shocked not by cruelty but by admiration. They had feared dishonor, yet they found themselves cherished in silence. That shock cut deeper than chains ever could. It forced them to admit that their enemies were men, that they themselves still longed to be seen as women, even in captivity. The war ended, but the bonds did not vanish overnight. When news of surrender reached the camps, both sides felt the weight of farewell. The women prepared to leave, to return to a homeland in ruins. The soldiers prepared to let them go, carrying only memories. At the gates, glances were exchanged more raw than any words. Some smiled faintly, others turned away quickly to hide their faces. A few whispered quiet wishes neither side would ever admit. One prisoner later recalled, "When I stepped onto the truck, I looked back. He was watching me. He raised his hand slightly, almost like a farewell. I lowered my eyes, but in my heart I carried that moment forever." The women returned home to devastation. Cities bombed, families broken, hunger spreading. They could not speak of what they had experienced. To admit that their captors had looked at them with longing, even with love, would have been betrayal. And so they locked the memories away, silent for decades. But the memories remained. The soldiers carried their silence too. They returned to farms, to cities, to families. They married, raised children, lived lives outwardly ordinary. But in the quiet of night they remembered. They remembered eyes across a fence, a hand brushing against bread, a song sung in the dark. They remembered love that never crossed the line, love that haunted because it remained unfulfilled. This was the deepest shock of all, not that enemies had looked at each other with hatred, but that they had looked at each other with love, and that love had survived only in silence. The surrender of Japan in 1945 came as a thunderclap, but for the women behind American fences it arrived like a whisper carried on the wind. They heard it first in the guarded voices of soldiers, then in the sudden loosening of discipline, then in the silence that followed. The war was over. Yet in the stillness of that revelation, the women felt no victory, no relief, only the heaviness of what they had lived through. For captivity had not scarred them with cruelty as they expected, but with something stranger, something they would never forget. They had been shocked not by hatred, but by love withheld. The camp changed overnight. Orders softened, routines relaxed. Soldiers who once barked commands now spoke more gently, their eyes lingering longer, their faces betraying what discipline had always tried to hide. The women noticed. They always noticed. One wrote in her diary, "They no longer hide it. Their eyes follow us as we walk. The war is over, and yet something remains between us, something that cannot be spoken." The Americans felt it too. The barrier of war had fallen, but the barrier of duty remained. They had resisted for so long that to confess now seemed more dangerous than ever. And yet, knowing the women would soon depart, their hearts ached with unfulfilled longing. One soldier scribbled in his journal, "I will never see her again. I never touched her, never spoke more than an order, but she will haunt me until I die." Farewells began with trucks pulling up to the camps, engines rumbling, soldiers calling names. The women gathered their few belongings, blankets, scraps of paper, small carvings gifted in silence. They lined up, eyes forward, hearts racing. For as much as they longed to return home, they also knew they were leaving something behind, something forbidden yet real. At the gates, the guards stood in rows. Some stared straight ahead, faces stony. Others looked away quickly, ashamed of the wetness in their eyes. A few dared to glance directly at the women as they boarded the trucks. In those glances lived everything they could never say. One woman later recalled, "He raised his hand, just slightly, as though to wave. I lowered my eyes, but my heart carried that gesture forever." On the voyage back across the Pacific, the women stood at the ship rails, watching the American coast fade. They felt as though they were leaving not just a country, but a secret buried in silence. They could never tell their families that American soldiers had admired and that they had been looked at with longing instead of hatred. To speak of such things would be betrayal. And so they carried the memory wordlessly, tucked away in hearts that would never stop aching. When they arrived in Japan, the contrast was unbearable. Cities lay in ruins, homes reduced to rubble, families scattered by hunger and fire. They returned not to life, but to survival. Any mention of what they had experienced in America was impossible. They told stories of fences, of labor, of hunger. They spoke of discipline, of silence, of waiting. But they did not tell of the glances, the restrained affection, the love that had haunted them. Yet in hidden diaries, in whispers shared only in old age, the truth surfaced. One woman wrote years later, "The greatest burden was not their cruelty, but their kindness. I prepared myself for shame. Instead, they gave me glances I could not bear. To this day, I do not know if it was mercy or torment." Another admitted, "I should have hated them. Instead, I remember the way one looked at me, as though I was the only woman in the world. That memory never left me." For the American soldiers, the silence was just as heavy. They returned home to parades, to families, to farms and cities. They married, raised children, built lives. But in quiet moments, they remembered. They remembered the women who walked past them each day, the hands that brushed against theirs when bread was passed, the eyes that met theirs across fences. They remembered the love that never crossed the line. One veteran confessed late in life, "I never touched her, never kissed her, never spoke her name. But she has lived with me every day. My wife never knew, my children never guessed. But in my heart, I always carried her." Another wrote, "I fought in jungles, I stormed beaches. But the hardest battle I ever fought was in that camp, every night, against myself." The shock for both sides was the same. Restraint. To be so near, to feel so much, and yet to do nothing. That silence scarred deeper than violence ever could. It revealed a humanity neither side was prepared to face. It proved that even in war, even between enemies, the heart could not be chained. Decades passed. The women grew old, their diaries hidden, their memories buried. Some confessed only on deathbeds, whispering truths that families could scarcely believe. "There was a soldier," one said. "He looked at me as no one ever had. He never touched me. But I loved him, though I could never admit it." The men grew old too. Some wrote memoirs, careful to omit the deepest truths. Others left journals filled with confessions never meant to be read. One journal discovered after a veteran's death contained a single line repeated again and again. "I loved her, and I let her go." Historians rarely tell these stories. They prefer maps, treaties, battles, numbers. But beneath the surface of war lived another history, a history of glances, of silences, of love unspoken. It was not the love of romance or marriage. It was the love of recognition, of humanity seen across a divide. It was forbidden, unfulfilled, but no less real. The Japanese women who returned home carried it in silence, living lives outwardly ordinary but inwardly haunted. The American soldiers carried it too, burying their memories under decades of duty, family, and time. But when they closed their eyes at night, both remembered. They remembered the shock of being seen not as enemy but as man and woman. One woman, interviewed in her 80s, finally confessed, "I thought I would forget. I never did. I still see his face when I close my eyes. I do not know his name, but I remember his eyes. They were my enemy's eyes, yet they were filled with something else, something I could not hate." Another, when asked what haunted him most about the war, answered, "Not the battles, not the killing. What haunts me is the silence of those nights. The way she walked past me, and I could not speak. That is what I carry." And so the legacy of those camps was not written in blood, but in silence. It was a silence that revealed humanity where propaganda demanded hatred, that uncovered love where only enmity was supposed to exist. It was the silence of restraint, and it left scars deeper than any wound of war. The story of the Japanese women and the American soldiers who loved them without ever speaking is not a tale found in official archives. It is found in diaries hidden in floorboards, in confessions whispered in old age, in memories that refused to die. It is the story of love that existed only in silence, of glances that carried more weight than words, of hearts that beat against the walls of duty but never broke through. And perhaps that is why it endures. Because in a world that demanded hate, they discovered love. Because in a war that demanded violence, they discovered restraint. And because in captivity that demanded despair, they discovered humanity. The greatest shock of all was not that American soldiers fell in love with their prisoners. The greatest shock was that they loved them silently, faithfully, without ever crossing the line. That love, unfulfilled yet unforgettable, became the heaviest burden of all, the love that lived only in memory, but lived forever.